promoting and supporting some of the cornerstones of the American experience. It's all about family, faith, and freedom. Now let's get back to the Curtis Report with your host, Barry Curtis.
Welcome back to the Curtis Report. I want to tell you a story about someone who died. Oftentimes, I'll tell you of remarkable individuals you may not have heard of who have served their country, honored their God, protected their family, have been patriots. From time to time, we run across no less a remarkable person, but their deeds have placed them on the wrong side of a patriotic history. Izola Ware Curry died. Name doesn't ring a bell? Perhaps it shouldn't. But what she did almost changed the course of history. And to hear her victim tell it, it changed his life forever. Izola Ware Curry. She died this month at the age of 98. You see, Izola Ware Curry was a mentally ill woman who in 1958 stabbed the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King at the Harlem book signing. That's an episode that a decade later would become a rhetorical touchstone in the last sermon of Dr. King's life. He'd recount that many times over the years, but the day before he died, that would play prominently in his last words. Miss Curry died in a nursing home, the last stop on a series of institutions that have been her home for more than a half a century. Her death confirmed by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in New York City. What surprised many observers at the time of the crime in 1958 was that Miss Curry herself was black. She was black. Many people would think that any threat on the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, and of course ultimately his murderer, would be white, perhaps racist. But no, Izola Ware Curry, who stabbed Dr. Martin Luther King in 1958, was black. She was a daughter of sharecroppers from the rural South. Questions persisted about what could have moved her to attack Dr. King. At the time, Dr. King was a 29-year-old Alabama preacher who assumed the national stage amid the Montgomery bus boycott in 55 and 56. That stabbing nearly cost King his life, requiring hours of surgery to remove Miss Curry's blade. And her blade was a 7-inch ivory-handled steel letter opener, which had lodged near his heart. If he has so much as sneezed, this is what the doctor says, if he has so much as sneezed, he would not have survived with that blade so close to his heart. Dr. King, who afterwards said he bore no animosity toward Miss Curry and did not want even charges pressed. He memorialized Mrs. Curry, not by name, but by her actions. The day before he died, in that famous speech in which he wrote, and he said, "I've been to the mountaintop." That speech he delivered in Memphis on April 3rd, 1968, the day before he was assassinated. It endures as one of his most famous speeches. You know, the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of Dr. King's aorta. This is Dr. King's given his own account. Once the aorta is punctured, you're drowned in your own blood, and that's the end of you, according to Dr. King. This is interesting. Of all the letters of consultation when Dr. King was in the hospital that poured in, Dr. King recounted this one letter written to him that he thought he should tell us about. He said he'd never forget this letter. The letter reads, "Dr. King, I'm a 9th grade student at White Plains Hospital." And this is a letter written to him by a 14-year-old girl while he was in the hospital recovering from that stab from Izola Ware Curry. She said, "Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School. While it should not matter, I would like to mention to you that I'm a white girl. This is a 9th grade white girl writing to Dr. Martin Luther King in 1958. She went on to say, I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had much as sneeze, you would have died. And I'm simply writing to you to say, I'm happy you didn't sneeze. Dr. King often recounted this in speeches. And in one particular speech, when he recounted that letter, he went on to say, and I want to say, this is Dr. King speaking, that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze. He went on to say, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when students all over the South started sitting in on lunch counters. He went on to say that if he had sneezed, he would not have seen the Freedom Riders in the early 60s, nor given his I Have a Dream speech at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, nor seen the passage of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 64, nor have been involved in Selma, Montgomery, and the marches there at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965, which are celebrating some 50 years on. And so Dr. King concluded in that speech, I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze. And of course, he was shot to death by James Earl Ray in Memphis the next day after delivering that speech. Apart from this speech, basically, Mrs. Curry vanished from history. Deemed unfit to stand trial, she was committed to mental institutions and pretty much presumed dead. Even a 2002 book that was published about the stabbing of Dr. King, that book was entitled When Harlem Nearly Killed King by Hugh Parsons. It didn't chart her life much after the stabbing event. Miss Curry died in a nursing home. Isola Ware was born in June 1916 near Adrian, a village in east central Georgia. She appears to have little education beyond grade school, and after a brief marriage to James Ware dissolved, Miss Curry moved to New York City, where she found work as a domestic person. She was a maid. There she began to experience paranoid delusions that would overtake her completely, and she was only 40 years old. Her mental state made it increasingly hard for her to hold jobs, so she bounced around to Virginia, Savannah, Miami, West Palm Beach, Kentucky, Columbia, so many different places. Her neighbor said she was a very antisocial woman. Mr. Parsons wrote that Curry spoke with a distinct Southern accent, but her words were often unintelligible. A dozen years before, she would write letters to the NAACP, that's the National Advancement for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She thought this organization was a communist organization, and in her mind, this group was persecuting her. This is her paranoid delusions. And then she said they were following her. She actually wrote these letters, and they turned it over to the FBI. It's in the National Archives. After time, Dr. King rose to prominence, and her delusions centered less on the NAACP and more on this young preacher, Dr. King. And on that afternoon of September the 20th, 1958, Dr. King, signing autographed copies of his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, The Montgomery Story. He was in Blumstein's department store at 230 West 125th Street there in New York City. Miss Curry was elegantly dressed and elegantly attired, and her glasses, the sequin little things on her glasses. She had a loaded .25 handgun in her purse. And in her handbag, she also had the letter opener. She walked up to Dr. King and said, "Are you Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Witnesses says that Dr. King never looked up, but just was signing books." And he responded to her without looking up, "Yes, I am." The next thing Dr. King said he remembered was someone pounding on his chest in the hospital. Isola Ware Curry, who stabbed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1958. dies at the age of 98. That's the end of our show this week. We'll see you next week. Remember, on the seventh day, God rested and he thought. And on the eighth day, God made radio.
Conservative principles and the man who's not afraid to use them.
I can hear you!
Thanks for tuning in. The Curtis Report with Barry Curtis will be back with a fresh take on the week's events and the issues that matter to you.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
Faith, family, and freedom. Join us right here on your home for The Curtis Report.
The Curtis Report.